pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, Palm/Passion Sunday is here again. It's days like this where I find myself wondering, has it really been a year? This is a special day for many, especially for children. It's a Sunday with excitement and memorable activities, and some activities that are not so memorable, like how did I forget the gospel lesson is so very long. Many of you probably have memories of Palm Sunday from your childhood. You remember hearing the story of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem riding on a colt, followers and onlookers waving branches taken from palm trees and crying out, "Hosanna!" That's a lot more excitement than we normally have on a Sunday morning. But then we go right into Holy Week. We move directly into the Passion story. Jesus is arrested, tried, tortured, and killed. It could almost give a person whiplash, the glory of Palm Sunday to the agony of the Passion in 60 seconds. But life is like that. Joy is interspersed with grief, happiness with sadness, and we can't often separate the two. When I was a teen, I often struggled with depression. I'd have long periods of despair when I had little or no hope. Someone told me once that I was suffering so much because Satan knew that I was destined for great things. And that's why I was experiencing all those hardships. The devil was inflicting pain on me to keep me from my divinely appointed calling. And that did give me some comfort, though it also made me wonder if maybe I could have just a slightly less important destiny so Satan would attack me so much. But the question we sometimes ask ourselves when we are struggling is, when will we have suffered enough? When is it enough? The Isaiah text is one of those so-called servant songs. These are 4 songs or poems talking about an unnamed servant of God who ends up suffering horribly at the hands of the nations. He's often referred to as the suffering servant. The prophet that wrote this song most likely lived towards the end of the Babylonian captivity. In this passage, the servant is speaking directly, though it's not mentioned who they are talking to. In the first section, the servant talks about their calling, their vocation, how God called the servant to speak and how the servant did not allow others to stop them from speaking. The passage ends with court language where God vindicates the servant, declares them righteous. So the servant can be confident that God will help them. The theme of suffering appears in our reading from Philippians as well. The passage records an ancient Christian hymn that praises Jesus' humility. The story moves from down and then it moves back up. Jesus refuses equality with God. Instead, he empties himself and takes the form of a slave. Humbling himself, he becomes obedient even to the point of death. So all the way down. But then turns around and goes back up because God exalts him and gives him a name above all other names, so that every knee should bend and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, which of course has been used in more contemporary Christian songs as well. Here the story is one of humble obedience that leads to death, but also glory. Our theme of suffering continues in our gospel lesson, where we all suffered as the reading kept going on and on. This morning, we pretty much heard the whole Passion story from the Gospel of Mark. Unlike other passages from the Gospel, this passage doesn't focus on what Jesus did or what he said. Rather, the focus is on what happened to Jesus, what was done to him. Here, Jesus is likened to us. We all know what it's like to be in a position where we have no control over what was done to us by others. Jesus is conspired against, betrayed, captured, tried, mocked, beaten, crucified, buried. Jesus is abandoned by those whom he loved, those closest to him who could have offered him some comfort. But Jesus is left alone. This is a consistent message in the Gospel of Mark, that to be the anointed of God, the Christ, is to suffer and die. The audience of this gospel would have been a community that knew persecution. This story would bring them comfort, knowing that Jesus suffered just as they are suffering now. Now, these three passages have long been understood to demonstrate something called redemptive suffering. That is the belief that suffering can actually have a positive effect, that it can bring redemption. One person's suffering can bring good to the whole. In this understanding, the prophet from Isaiah or Jesus from the New Testament suffered so that others might benefit. The church has explained that in different ways throughout the ages. The early church talked about Jesus' death defeating the powers of death. Others talked about Jesus' death as a ransom to the devil for the souls of humanity. In the Middle Ages, Jesus' death was understood as a way to satisfy the offended honor of God. Around the time of the Reformation, Jesus' death was seen as our justly deserved punishment that Jesus took in our place. All of these so-called atonement theories, that's what we call them, were trying to make sense of why Jesus had to die. Now, please note that no atonement theory has ever made it into the creeds, and the universal church has never had a single consistent understanding of why Jesus had to die. And the New Testament leaves it somewhat ambiguous. Although it mentions sacrifice many times, it's unclear exactly what the nature of that sacrifice is. I say this because some Christians will tell you that there is one way of understanding the atonement, but that is ignoring the complexities of our scriptural tradition and our church history. Too often, the redemptive suffering has been used against people at the margins of society. Too many wives being hurt by their husbands have been told that they must endure that abuse for the greater good. Too many minorities have been told that they must suffer for the greater good. I think about in our own history in the 50s and 60s when African Americans wanted equal rights, and many leaders would say, well, we'll get there, we just need to wait a little longer. We're not quite there yet, just a little longer. So they're being asked to sacrifice for the greater good. See, we must be very careful how we talk about redemptive suffering. To avoid those dangers, I turn to the French philosopher René Girard. He talked a lot about something called a scapegoat. Scapegoats are people that the larger society uses to blame for the problems of society, or they can be seen as the ones who must pay the price for society. Jews during the Holocaust would be a classic example. Hitler blamed them for Germany's troubles. But we could also talk about indigenous people at the hands of colonists, how those supposedly uncivilized people must suffer so that we can develop our countries and become wealthy and powerful. These people are forced to endure suffering because society has declared they must pay the price. But Girard argued that Christianity fundamentally rejects that concept. He said that Jesus, in his death, was the ultimate scapegoat. His death showed just how unjust and evil scapegoating is. In fact, Girard said that Jesus was the scapegoat to end all scapegoats. Through Jesus' death, God revealed how corrupt our governments and religious authorities can be, how those in power will use violence to enforce their power, sacrificing the few for what they claim is the greater good. But it's really just about them holding on to their power. In effect, Girard unveils the idea of redemptive suffering for what it can often be, a way to oppress the weaker parts of society. But the scapegoating must stop. Enough is what God says to us. That scapegoating must stop is the good news of the gospel. The message of the gospel is that God says enough. You see governments, religions, and other institutions of society been put on notice by God. Blaming the few for the problems of the many, that is evil. Forcing innocent people to suffer for others is wrong. God desires that all of us be free people, able to enjoy all the benefits of society while having the same responsibilities as everyone else. No one should be held down due to race, nationality, class, sex, sexual orientation, or religion. God's will is that all people be liberated from all the forces that seek to hold them down. The powers that be, your days are numbered. Now, of course, as an adult, I've often thought back to those days, and I was told that my suffering was just because Satan was determined to bring me down. And of course, it's easy as an adult to look back and say, wow, that's a very self-congratulatory way to look at it. Wow, look how important I am. But I suppose we do that sometimes with suffering. We think, well, look at how special I am. But if we look at this through the filter of understanding Jesus as the final scapegoat, then we have to say, wait a minute, that can't be right. That isn't the way that works. There are no more scapegoats. Jesus took care of that. Too often we've been willing to resort to violence. Too often that's been inflicted on the weak. But God in Jesus Christ has shown us a better way, the way of love, the way of forgiveness, the way of nonviolence. Question any institution or person that scapegoats anyone, because God has said enough.